It's the return of Samus on NES Works Episode 48, Part 2. Fittingly, Metroid is another NES breakout title that was only made possible through the platform's technological advances. This was R&D1's first release for the Famicom Disk System, the same peripheral whose storage capacity and rewritable capabilities made Zelda and Kid Icarus possible. And, as with those games, Metroid's Western release had to be delayed until ROM cartridges capable of matching the disk system's features arrived. Metroid uses the same password system as Kid Icarus for its save data, further reinforcing the special status Nintendo of America had bestowed upon Zelda, but also opening the door for all kinds of oddball password hacks that have become part of the game's legacy. Metroid's in-game persistence was every bit as extensive as Zelda's. Not only does the game record Samus's current status, which can include a range of equipment, health-boosting energy tanks, and dozens of missile expansions, but it also records which shielded doors have been unlocked, which bosses have been destroyed, and even which of the final boss's protective barriers have been whittled down. Besides losing the convenience of a quick continue scheme, Metroid also lost a few other elements in the transition from disk system to ROM card, including sampled audio effects and a rich rendition of its opening and ending themes. But Nintendo reworked the game slightly for America, adding a couple of quality of life features to make the adventure slightly less toilsome. The best of these improvements is the fact that passwords record Samus's current in-game location. On Disk System, she begins every session back at the start of the world, whereas in the US release she begins at the entrance to the most recent zone she had visited. The Western release also makes enemy patterns less random and adds an auto-fire feature. And if you manage to beat the game quickly enough, it also allows you to play as Samus without her armor in the New Game Plus mode, something not present in the Japanese release. Motherbrain's Zebesian lair is divided into 6 different regions, a feature most likely designed to accommodate the limitations of the disk system. The elevators she uses to move between regions contain load screens in Japan, whereas the Western version makes these transitions seamless. The use of standalone zones helps make the game more manageable though. Each region has its own distinct feel, unique creatures, and even a particular approach to hidden passages. The rocky Brinstar zone consists of lengthy hallways and vertical shafts. This allows for quick traversal, which is helpful since Brinstar is a de facto hub that connects most of the game's regions together. Fiery Norfair is the densest and most complex of the game's environments, riddled with invisible passages that require players to bomb and shoot every visible surface in order to find the path forward. Norfair contains lots of tightly packed chambers and seemingly identical structures, making for a somewhat overwhelming labyrinth that demands players map it out by hand. Kraid's lair is full of tricks and traps and difficult vertical passages, while Ridley's lair is more of a straightforward combat gauntlet. And finally, the Motherbrain's inner sanctum, Torian, contains no secrets or power-ups, only a dozen deadly Metroids, and the final boss herself. Each area also contains its own musical theme, composed by Hirokazu Tanaka, and by far the best collection of tunes ever to appear in a console game to this point. Or at the very least, it's right up there with Castlevania, a game Metroid predates in their respective original Japanese releases. Each region's tune perfectly complements the nature of that zone. Brinstar gives you a rousing, adventuresome march to set Samus on her adventure. Norfair has a slower, almost dirge-like quality, fitting for the more measured pace the area's complex passages force upon players. Kraid's lair has a mysterious, otherworldly sound, while Ridley's repetitive loop suffocates the player like an oppressive blanket that discourages lingering any longer than it takes to kill Ridley and escape. You need to defeat Kraid and Ridley, Metroid's 2 mini-bosses, in order to take on the final boss. Their destruction causes a pair of statues to activate outside Motherbrain's lair, creating a bridge that allows Samus to reach Torian. Clever fans have managed to sequence break this requirement by using the Ice Beam to freeze enemies in place and create a makeshift bridge to Torian, but defeating each boss significantly boosts your maximum missile capacity, and you need missiles in order to destroy the creatures that lurk in the final zone, so skipping the bosses is more like trying to win a dare than it is a viable strategy. But that's okay, Metroid lends itself to experimentation thanks to both its complexity and the fact that the entire game barely holds together on a technical level. And the fact that Metroid gives you different endings and rewards based on your time to complete its nonlinear quest from start to finish makes it one of the earliest motivators for modern fandom thrills like speedruns and sequence breaking. An expert player can do preposterous things like skipping the damage-reducing Varia power-up to see what unarmored Samus looks like with her default color palette. Turns out she is a brunette. And then there are the so-called secret world, non-existent areas of Zepis accessed by working your way outside the bounds of the properly defined game map. Metroid can be a vexing experience in the year 2019. Many of its creators' design choices seem downright hateful, or at least unfriendly, more than 3 decades after the game's debut. Death is a nuisance, since players begin every session with 30 points of health, even if Samus has maxed out her capacity at 699 points. You have to grind for health recovery items by killing enemies anytime you continue. Exploration can be a tiresome chore, especially in Norfair, where critical passages are hidden by normal-looking blocks that Samus has to detonate blindly one by one. Much of the game relies on Samus being able to freeze enemies in place with the Ice Beam, a combination weapon and tool that turns enemies into temporary platforms. But you can't wield both the Wave and Ice Beams at the same time. If you pick up the Wave Beam by mistake, your capacity for exploration becomes limited, and you can even become trapped in dead-end pits. Metroid's failings would naturally be addressed by Super Metroid, even the trivial ones. The only 2 resources you need to manage here are the health and missile refill icons dropped by enemies, but there's no way to dictate which ones will appear. You can have your missiles topped out and desperately need health, only to be given more missile recharges. In future games, enemies would only drop icons for resources that hadn't been fully recharged yet. Hidden passages would be placed more intuitively, and Samus would gain tools to help her spot them more easily. Bosses would adopt more challenging skills than the simplistic patterns they demonstrate here. Samus would gain the power to combine or toggle equipment. There would even be secret passages and shortcuts between isolated zones of the game. It's hard to judge Metroid's flaws too harshly though. In the context of its original 1987 release, Metroid is a work of extraordinary scope and vision. It's rough and often flawed, but it was easily the biggest and most determined game of this kind anyone had ever seen in '86 and '87. It's a confident creation, far more cohesive than Kid Icarus, and it laid the groundwork for countless other adventures to come. The blueprint for the platform action-adventure format. There's plenty to love about Metroid. Consider the final zone, Torian, which dispenses with the nonlinearity of what's come before and finally pits players against the fearsome creatures that lend the game its name. Metroid isn't the name of the protagonist, the world, or the villain. Metroids are mysterious creatures being corralled and bred in the inner sanctum of the space pirate fortress. And if you don't know the secret to defeating them, they're far deadlier than any other creature in the game. Only by freezing and then blasting a Metroid with 5 missiles can you destroy it. And if one makes contact with Samus, it latches onto her and begins quickly draining away her life. You can't shoot an attached Metroid to freeze it, only duck into ball form and use bombs to dislodge it. In other words, Metroids make full use of Samus's arsenal, and the player's entire repertoire of tricks. And even once you run the gauntlet and defeat them all, you still have to contend with Mother Brain. Her lair is barricaded by a series of regenerating biocomputers that have to be blasted down before they self-repair the damage you've inflicted. A task more easily said than done, since Samus is constantly being peppered with cannon fire and dodging strange, infinitely spawning energy rings that home in on her position. All of this leads up to Mother Brain herself, a stationary computer that has to be attacked through a gap in its protective barrier while dodging projectiles and trying to avoid being knocked into a moat of acid. Managed to defeat the final boss though, and Metroid still isn't over. Samus has to escape through a narrow shaft to the surface before the enemy fortress self-destructs. The escape up the ventilation shaft is a final test of player skills, since it requires navigating a lengthy series of tiny platforms. Samus's slippery jump physics work against you here, but it's not too challenging if you've learned how to leap from a neutral stance, something more easily said than done when you're anxiously racing against time. All in all, it's a great finale to a great game. It caps the meticulous exploration that defined much of the journey with a white-knuckled test of dexterity and nerve, and the final congratulatory message feels well-earned, whether or not you actually net the best ending. Despite all Metroid had going for it, Nintendo has struggled through the years to follow up on its legacy. There have been sequels and spin-offs aplenty, but the franchise also goes through periodic fallow spells in which its primary function amounts to cameo fodder for the likes of Super Smash Bros. Nevertheless, the original Metroid has been in constant circulation through Virtual Console and other mediums for more than a decade and a half, ever since Retro Studios included it as an unlockable bonus in Metroid Prime. The original Metroid also enjoyed one of the greatest remakes of all time in 2004's Game Boy Advance masterpiece, Metroid Zero Mission. Zero Mission reworked and expanded the NES game, incorporating new features, skills, areas, and bosses while carrying forward all the best lessons from Super Metroid, Metroid Fusion, and Metroid Prime. If it weren't for its unpopular stealth-centered epilogue, Zero Mission would probably stand as the incontrovertible finest chapter of the Metroid saga. And even when the games come few and far between, at the very least, Metroid gave us Samus Aran, one of gaming's greatest characters. The reveal of Samus's identity as a woman, the reward for completing Metroid within a slim window of time, was a genuine shock for most players at the time, seeing as how the US manual conspicuously referred to Samus as him throughout. Samus has proven to be the most enduring and popular character to emerge from Japan's mid-80s anime and manga trend of featuring and occasionally ogling tough warrior women in lead action roles. Perhaps that's because she has as much in common with Alien's Ellen Ripley as she does with Leda's Yoko or the Nightsabers.
I say we take off and nuke the entire site from orbit. It's the only way to be sure.
I mean, her recurring nemesis throughout the years even shares a name with Alien director Ridley Scott. Nintendo created something unique and special with Metroid. It's not quite Mario, and it's not even a Zelda-style action RPG. It falls somewhere comfortably in between. The company had come into its own with the Famicom Disk System in 1986, and the fruits of their inspiration began to make their way to the rest of the world here in the summer of 1987. It's difficult to imagine any publisher turning out so many landmark titles in such rapid succession as we saw with Kid Icarus, Zelda, and Metroid. But this was Nintendo's big push to make the NES a hit in the wake of the console's nationwide launch throughout the US, and it worked. No other console on the market at the time could compete with this trifecta of excellence. Atari's 2600 and 7800 and Sega's Master System had plenty to offer gamers, but Metroid capped a bold declaration from Nintendo. It offered quality and quantity like had never been seen before. Metroid was the final flourish on this push, and no wonder it's so dearly beloved among American fans. It represents a bold promise that Nintendo actually made good on, and it's a hell of a game in its own right, too. Next on NES Works, Taito gives it its best shot, but SNK reminds us once again that not every NES release is going to be a masterpiece, or even good for that matter.